인데 잼바제 상제냐 와예 조본 나주바 쇼예당고 템자나 관여 아야미스 아다진 거로고 시원 니도 치만 남다 저와 사모토 비트도 니도 치만 남다 저와 사모토 비트도 니도 시와라 양아 체메르 바니 네 데려와 동화 남바 거다 보지된디니 홍수 참 동화 주위 쪼라 동화 거베 지시차 아지 어디 되게 다 중국인 봐서 아니 가데 쓰와라 동화지 쓰와라 게와 동화지 쓰와라 연대 매매지 니도 치마당 저와 토비치도 동화지 쓰와야 안에 빵도 매도 셔나.
So then the next topic is that one might think that it's appropriate to exhibit lamentation or to have lamentations for relatives that have passed away in order to establish and improve one's relationship with the relatives that remain after that are still alive. And that's explained in verse 19, where it says, and the commentary says, though self-torment is of no benefit, here self-torment refers to the mourning practices of mourning of self-injury and so forth. Nevertheless, it cannot be dispensed with if one is to have a relationship with the surviving relatives. And then the verse here responds to that by saying, people in this world wander full, as it were, of suffering. Why fill with suffering people who already suffer?
Oh, yeah. 아니 지된바나 레왕키 시그나 아니 누아나바 거다보 지된디니 오서 참 세그래 지된바나 레왕키 부담 벌레지 왕기 아니 부담 부모 주네 누아나바 거밤 쳐봤다고 좋아 안 지된바디니 용서 참 받쳐라 시가나 지된디니 오서 참채 오니지 동아와 주비 듀라 사라신지 동아와 주비 듀라 아니 동아 사바 현괴배 지시 차대 현괴배 지시세가 말라 안 자자 대바 쳐바단 드라베 안 대다단 저와 토바라 그와 중세장 매베
So then it says here that if you say that it's appropriate to engage in that kind of extreme behavior when one's in a state of mourning in order to improve your relationship and secure it with surviving relatives, then that's incorrect. The explanation or response here is that worldly beings are born as boys and girls, as one's sons and daughters, by the force of karma, and they're filled. Being born in that way, they're filled with suffering, and it's as if they're filled up with suffering in the world, and in this world they wander in that sort of state of existence, and they're just by their very nature, such beings are pervaded with suffering, endure suffering, and when you see beings that are suffering by their very nature in that way, what's the point of imposing more suffering upon them, or placing them in a state of additional suffering on top of that, new forms of suffering? And the example that's given here, it's just like rubbing salt in a wound where there's already an injury and you're increasing the injury, and there's no point at all in doing that. Establishing that, trying to improve your relationships with the people that are remaining who are in that sort of state of suffering is completely pointless. There's no necessity to do that at all.
Oh yeah. 가서래 고추사자 매배 라니 코알라 타베 탑라 배바 차오 오체 좋아 나 되게 아니 배서라 비니 여바 지기 태도 파시라 지시지 태도 마시네 태베 편디 동아 깨바단 드라베 아니 고추사자 매
So it's, instead of behaving in that way, oneself should make effort towards methods that will enable one to achieve liberation from samsara. And an example is given here of the wrong way to behave, which is there were two sons, and one of them had their father die right in front of him. And after their father had died, the first son, before whom he had died, met the other son who wasn't aware that he had died, and just caused each of them to get more in a state of greater and greater misery. So there's no point at all in that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, that is something about the nidu nyamdang, nidu sodan, henjidu, duam drobala chabachi meriba, ni chevicana. Tarango down, droba yuruala chaba meriba, said that ni chenica, tabongo de la. That can't do a kind bar. Can't do a kind, drawa chitra gamai, duam, and droba. Do a dan in drawata, and henji do a nami nam.
So this leads into the next topic, which is that it's improper to develop a great deal of attachment towards associating with relatives, friends, and so forth. And this has two topics: the basic topic, and then showing as well that it's inappropriate to have attachment for associating with others for a long period of time. And the first topic, the basic exposition, is in verse 20, where it says that if meeting is a joy to you, why is parting not also a joy? Do not meeting and parting both seem to go together?
Oh yeah, that's it. Pastor, Chava Dunga Jitu Yinjang, Yenda Chava Dunga Jitunda, Yendan do a TV Juyimbe, and a Chaba Riso Shenayang, Mayindes. The castle, Kangi Dua Kayinde, said Kangi Dua, drop a guy doing by tea, Chava, Chita Gayu do some riba Mayindes. Chita Chava Gayu do some riba Mayinde, and it's do Seriba Mayin by the ribatas, Duadan Chava, Henji do. Henji do now, Minam de Chikona give it.
So here you might say, well, suffering, the separation from friends and relatives is a cause of suffering. However, however, being together with friends and relatives is a source of happiness. Therefore, it's appropriate to have attachment to that. And however, that's not the case. The response to that is that this meeting together with others, which is this source of which we think as a source of joy, why is it? If that's the case, why isn't it appropriate to consider separation or parting from friends and relatives to be a source of joy as well? It necessarily would be the case if being together with others, our friends and relatives, is essentially a source of happiness, then the separation from them would necessarily have to be a source of happiness as well, because isn't it the case that meeting and parting appear in coordination with one another? They occur together with each other. There's no meeting without parting, and no getting together with others without separation from them, because they occur from a single cause.
Oh yeah. When that's the mission, Nana Bangava Tramatang. Kasa to Jeji, the what you said, Jejang, Sekana, and that Dang. Oh, do all that the what you just try to watch Javana. Kasa to Jeji, the what you said, Jejang, Tatu Javatan, Shao.
The examples that are given to illustrate this is there's a goddess called Mangala, who is she's the goddess of good fortune, but she has a sister named Kalanasa or Black Nose, and the two always go together. Whenever Lady Luck shows up, the black-nosed goddess or demon of misfortune definitely comes along following after her. So that shows how the two are associated in that way. And then likewise, if we think about suffering food which has poison in it, it gives rise to a little bit of happiness for a while, but eventually it generates a great deal of suffering. So in the same way, this association with others when one is attached produces the same kind of misery.
Oh yeah. 他听我的心里，你话找把有人完了，查把没人把他啊，来了他妈越民了，忙他妈越民了，这那确实都同情，人不就讲查把民是，他查把爱讲是多把的多把的，他查把爱讲，查把讲多把你今年呢，多把有人为。 查于东啊，得了，你东啊是这是查我一诺先呐，
So then the next subject is that it's inappropriate to be attached to having a long association with others that are dear to us, friends and relatives and so forth. And that's explained in the verse 21, where it says, when the past is beginningless and the future endless, why do you notice being together, but not the separations, though they be long? So here someone might have the view that even though it's definitely the case that eventually we'll have to separate, since we associate with others that are dear to us for a long period of time, we don't need to really count that as the suffering of separation. We can discount the suffering of separation because it's of less duration. If you say that, that's incorrect.
Oh. 查我当贴把运通啦，多一人话没人把他是吧？可以叫我，考了叫我南极单位推了，他们要考了，他们要把没行。马我又推了样，他们要把没呐。军在机去系统同意多通行，对人不就讲。 找我同我没信，得了叫我没信，推就在这就多完了，下半天有人不查完了，叫我下关说的。
So then the explanation of this is that when beings in cyclic existence have a beginningless past and an endless future, why do we notice the very short periods of time when we're together but not notice the separations, although they are long? Why should we be depressed by them? Whoever is attached to such brief periods of being together should be depressed by the long separations that occur.
No. Oh yeah. That. 没看见前南那位去，是吧？前南那位去，出嘛先去大概前哇，有的两嘛他东啊哇决心都是，一点把那么第一人不查完了，两岸没写吧，就在咱查完了，两岸写吧，没人说我是。
The example here is of, if we take the example of some man who's been living in a foreign country for a long period of time, and while he was gone, his wife was taken by another man as his wife, and when he arrived back in his homeland after that long journey abroad, as soon as he got there, he suffered. So that's very similar to the way in which worldly people they're not made miserable by the long periods of separations which last these long durations, but when they're separated from those they're attached to for even a very short period of time, they they experience a great deal of misery, and that's of course illogical or improper.
Oh yeah. 他主把推走了， 뒤지 비수 소와라 차바 메르바테니 메르바니 깨지라서 뒤태남 내와 자단 자주지 대나 저주 대다라 남구 최대 참매자 어디 순거다 자와 유리양 자와디 유리양 양 서가 몇도 개와탕 서기 나가 뒤 서가 나가서 몇도 개와탕 만에 동게 뒤도 나와 싸워서 뒤지 피심지 셈치네 자위 동안 몇도 세나.
So then there's next says that it's inappropriate to be attached to the excellent things that occur during certain times of year, certain seasons. And the verse for this says, verse 22. Here, actually, it says time, but you can translate that as seasons. The seasons consist of moments, and they're actually definitely like enemies. Therefore, it's inappropriate. One should not have attachment to those. You should not have attachment to those which are like enemies to you. And so here, the person that's engaged in the dispute here says that even if it's the case that our separation from those we love is of long duration, then nevertheless during springtime when the flowers are blooming, or in the autumn when the moon shines so brightly, there are times when the seasons can distract our minds and remove any kind of suffering that we're feeling due to the separation. And if you think in that way, it's not correct.
Oh yeah. 깨지라서 뒤대나 내와 자당 자주대 시가라 여기 서가 나서 서가 모두 자와도 뜬디 도와 사와라 소비 아니 뒤지다 깨지다 탕지 유zam나서 뒤대나 림기 폐회 아니 취지 선비 깨지대 아니 선 뒤지 깨지대 사버 체배 내와 소토비 자당지 타르 소토비 자당 나와 주디 윤전되나 라주와 대다라 남바군도 아니 차바를 대차와 차바를 미샤오 시체 대자 미샤오.
So it's wrong to have that kind of attachment to the seasons, even if they have some fleeting beauty, like the flowers in the spring or the moon in the autumn, because these seasons are composed of moments. Moments themselves consist of seconds of time, and then seconds are microseconds, fleeting instants of time, and those moments of time, as they gradually increase during the course of the season, they exhaust the moments of your own life, and therefore they function very similar to an enemy that is capturing your life force and taking it away from you, and therefore it's completely inappropriate, wrong to have that kind of attachment to these things, the beautiful seasons which are functioning like your enemies.
Oh yeah, bena gemo jemeese. 동아 코마를 제장 제모라 차바 체지 양가 메제바 나시. 뒤질라 차바기 아니 지금 많이 대단 잡아래.
So the example here it's given is when worldly people are attached to the seasons, spring and fall and so forth, the beauties, wonders of the seasons. It's just like an old woman who's constantly being tormented by her mistress, the mistress that governs her, but nevertheless she has kind of attachment to that mistress, and even because of her attachment, she doesn't feel miserable about the way the mistress is mistreating her. So that kind of attachment to the seasons, beautiful seasons, is similar to that.
Oh yeah, da sumba chawang yambala chapa pane tabi lam dubala zamba dambala chawang singi lepda le shopa chapa pane 이 nyaba chagöba 첼레라 되와 미르바당 chawang yambala chapa tane 토마니네 yamba ten르바 담바 이 예배나네 담봉여와 chagöba 첼레라 되와 미르바테 다디mbara 롱안 차비 지바이 김량에와 미주나 캐와 수식에바네 제거 제바 줄 알아 셰바 대다리 메지스 년당 차와 가외 뒤전에 나서도 아니 엠베나서 민주와 셴나스. Yeah.
So the next topic is showing that one should abandon one's attachment to low forms of activity, low activities, wrong kinds of behavior, and make effort to accomplish the path of liberation. So that there's an instruction to generate that effort, strive for liberation. And this has subdivisions it's inappropriate to view that which one necessarily ought to do as if it was some kind of punishment. And then this in turn has the first topic, and that is that, I'm sorry, that's the topic here, that it's inappropriate to consider that which one definitely ought to do as if it was punishment. And that's given in verse 123, where it says, fool, or you could translate this as dummy, because you fear separation, you do not leave home. Who that is wise does under punishment what must certainly be done. So here then the explanation of the verse is that you might think, well, what's been explained above, that is the case. However, it's difficult to separate from one's relatives and so forth, one's associate, and therefore, out of fear of that, I don't want to go into the forest. Going into the forest meaning renounce the world and take up the renunciate's life.
뭐야, 다 되게 농안 저기 집안에 있어요. 노정 양바 최, 시랑 양바 뭐 노정 양바 최. 년세당 자위 집안에 아니 가서 양바 어다다 누지 양바 땜비 치도 아니 침량 양바 메주나 년세당 자와 테니 치다긴 양바를 이 양바를 채배 아니 랑도라 캐와 수시 양바니 차급이 내테니 랑도라 캐와 수시 내가 차급이 내테니 내가 치다기 차바 제비 레왕 그 차바 줄서 랑도라 캐와 캐와 수시기 내가 차급이 내테니 내가 치다기 차바 제비 왕기 차바 줄 대나 치다기 차바 마구와 나서 sonde 타바주바를 좀 마셔.
So the answer to that is that here again it says, "Oh, you dummy, you fool! If because of that fear of being separated from your friends, and if you're unable to go out, renounce life in the household, go out from your home, and go and resort to an isolated place which is free from the kinds of hustle and bustle of householders' life. If you're not able to do that, then it is necessarily the case anyway that death is going to make you separate from your friends and relatives. Your own death is certainly going to cause you to separate from your friends and relatives. And then that being the case, why is it that 랑도라 캐파 수식
랑도라 캐와 수식 내가 차급이 내테니 치다기 차바 제비 왕기 차바 줄었어. 내가 치다기 차바 마구바 안에 나서 타바 주고
So the thing, someone who is skilled and educated in the things that ought to be done and ought to be avoided, this action of going out from the household into the forest, taking up renunciation, in other words, that's something that a wise person, someone who understands things, definitely recognizes that they ought to do. And that sort of going forth, leaving one's home anyway, is something that will occur by the force of one's own death anyway. That is the punishment that is inflicted upon us by the Lord of death is dying itself is going to entail that we have to separate from the homes that we're living in and leave our relatives and so forth behind. Thus, if one's a wise or skillful person, one shouldn't have to wait for the orders of the Lord of Death, who's commanding you to do this, but instead one ought to go out from the house and leave and go into the forest and make effort in order to accomplish one's own liberation. So the example that's given here is we shouldn't act like villagers who don't pay their taxes until they're actually afflicted with the punishment of failing to pay their taxes. If a villager waits until the ruler comes and harms them before they pay their taxes, of course that's foolish. And then likewise, if we wait until the Lord of Death comes and inflicts the punishment of death upon us, if we wait for that to separate from our relatives and go and renounce the world, then that too is foolish.
Oh yeah, that's
So then here the last point on this is that one should, and it gives an instruction on how it's appropriate to resort to an isolated place for practice from the very beginning by giving up one's attachment to low forms of activities, low behavior. And this is explained in verse 24, where it says, you may think that you must obviously go to the forest once this has been done. Whatever you do must be left behind. What is the value of having done it? Or you could think, you could translate it as this, that similarly that you might think like this, once I've finished this job, then clearly I ought to go into the forest, but whatever it is that you have to do, you're going to have to abandon it anyway, so what's the point of doing it in the first place? And then the person who's resisting the argument here might think, well, even though it's the case that I necessarily have to give up my relatives eventually, even though that is the case, first I need to have a son in order to consign the responsibilities of the household upon him, and then I will definitely go into the forest. If you say that, I think that way.
Oh yeah. 具体前呢，啥话呢？那时候抓起俺们什么这个去普及吧了说，俺你瞧我地上的钱呢，然后俺娃的起边呢是抓瞧我，俺们就什么呢？瞧我康熙前讲对没事我当我瞧我，康熙前讲对没事我当我瞧我，对这这部总裁讲。当我现在开始是对这部总裁讲没进步的切我了，对这部总裁讲没进步的切我了，原天继续约的。So
the reply to this is that you here, if you think, well, once I've accomplished these activities of producing a son, then definitely it's it would be appropriate time in the future sometime to go to this an isolated forest to practice. You think like that. If you think like that, then the response to that is that whatever actions you do, they're definitely, eventually, inevitably, you'll have to give them up. And since they won't produce any kind of meaningful any kind of meaningful result that you actually desire, those kinds of actions, then what's the merit, what sort of good quality do those actions actually possess? So that being the case, from the very first, it's appropriate to cast them aside. The examples that, to illustrate this wrong sort of thought is, it's like someone who's trying to polish a stone for no reason at all. It's impossible, an impossible task. Or someone who foolishly takes up a dirty mango that's fallen in the dirt. They clean it off and then they throw it aside. Those illustrate the foolishness of this kind of thinking.
Oh yeah, that didn't seem to me about going to pay the la. Danny Chu and young Samba Kalang, what you do about. Tenny Chapa, you want that Chitala Kalachi. Chitala Kalachi is you should tell much at that, do you? Chitala Kalachi. Oh, Kato Nasu draw. Embenesu draw, so you images. Nasu draw, embenesu draw, Jimbo, so you image. Datan Dagiwa, Chabe, Jina, draw Miniso Shana.
So then the next is the concluding verse here is showing illustrating the benefits of meditating on impermanence, and so this is verse 25. Whoever with certainty has the thought, I am going to die, having completely relinquished attachment, why would they fear even the Lord of death? And this is explained that here again you might resist this idea and think, well, yes, it is the case that going into the forest, renouncing, is the principal objective that I have. However, out of my attachment to myself and the things that I possess, the things that belong to myself, out of fear of losing them, I'm unable to go into the forest, if you think that.
Oh, dear. That Chiwa Midaba Gombala Jamba China said, Dani Chiwa Yamsaba Kalang, Yesuba said it. Chiwa Midaba Gombala Jamba China, Datan Dagiwala Chabata Tower Ducres, Jamba China. Dida Dagiwala Chabata Tower Judy, Dida Dani Namji, never missing. Midu Chiwo Yamdu Semba, Anna Kangala. Samba Kana Yobatella, you do chew a touch about or Yoba Chua Tenny, or you do chew a touch about or Yoba Chua Tenny, and then do the bandy. I shall not do the and Dodgy Bandy. Dala Sibi Chapa also down with Chidala Kala, Jibabana Taba Taba Juve, Nasu draw down, put on draw la Jiba Minjuro.
So here, the answer to that is that if one makes effort, or when one has made effort to meditating upon the impermanence of death, then it's possible to become free from one's attachment to oneself, as well as to the things that one possesses, the possessions of yourself. And as follows. we can see how it's possible to become free from attachment to the things that we possess, as follows. If you think, well, if you think like this, I don't know when I'm going to die, but it's probably the case that I'm quickly going to die. As soon as you have that kind of thought, and as soon as you've developed a sort of strong, firm determination that you're quickly going to die, then at that time you'll be able to give up entirely all of the busyness that ordinarily occupies us, all of the activities of business and so forth running around, and one is also able to give up one's attachment even to the present life that one is experiencing, and once you've achieved that, you've given up attachment to this life entirely, then how would you be afraid of death, of the Lord of death in particular, but death itself? By giving up all of that that fear of separation from your possessions and yourself, then since it's the case that you would be able to, and understanding that you'd be able to understand to achieve liberation, then why would you be afraid of going into the forest and becoming separated from your children?
Oh yeah, that 기반 민주로 빼나 가사 도매 바 차비 치도 아니 두장이 가사 나도 써도 주바당 가사 두장 돌아와시노 에임바라 두단제베 가사 돌아와시노.
Examples that are given to illustrate these attitudes is like someone who employs a special kind of ring, which is able to test where food is poisoned or not, or maybe a ring that is able actually to eliminate the poison from the ring, from the food, and then the other example is like the way in which people, once they know food is poisoned, they cast it aside as valueless and danger, that's the examples.
Oh yeah, that 대단한 거를 해봤다를 시다기 샤완도 주네. 아니, 시다기 샤완도 주네. 내가 칭해 왔다. 남지 내가 매바 양도 삼바 차대스. 어디 치와미다 바 삼바 딜라 치레바 치나. 아니 랑 코만나자 배바 매바 깨라스. 미다바 또바 마제나 현도나 그위신이 보도와 송바다를 치와 미다로 마제 봐도 또바 현게 그 남가바 임배 남현 가바 임배 이자 라베 미다바다 차위 미다바 니가 빈den도 검고 그래.
Thus, as all this entire explanation that's been given above, the point of it is so that we will think again and again that how it is that we are under the control of death. It's certain that we will die, but it's also the case that we don't know at all when we're going to die. We have no certainty at all with respect to when we're actually going to die. And we have to think about those points, 2 points, the certainty of death and the uncertainty of the time of death over and over again. Once we've done that and established a sound basis within this meditation, then the higher realizations of the path, the higher paths within the stages of the path, we'll be able to give rise to them with virtually no effort at all, effortlessly. It's this. Otherwise, if we don't do this first, it's just like Geshe Potoa said. He said that until we've produced within ourselves the mind which understands the impermanence of death, then it's what we've done is basically shut down the path of generating any other higher realizations within the path. There's no, without having accustomed oneself to meditation on death, there's no way to give rise to the other realizations that follow after this realization. And that being the case, we need to meditate constantly upon the two forms of impermanence, the coarse impermanence as well as the subtle form of impermanence.
Oh yeah, that's the Nyugu sebi chingwa jiga chabata, nyabata gudila, ane sebaki, sebe wanga, ane kore chingwa ge, ane chingwa jaba chabata. Ane yaba rubla zumbu guma, cho. Sura guyi sawa tambade, toma chiwa jesu chamba wo, siro chama toma chiwa jesu chabata, nyaba gudila chebe chingwa chabata, yaba rubla zebaki, ane guma yinzang, ane sura guyi sawa tambade. So
there's a concluding verse by Gyaltsen in which he says, which is a verse which summarizes the subject here. That which cuts craving for reward and honor, the best spur to practice with effort in seclusion, the excellent secret of all the scriptures is initially to remember death.
So then there's Then
the title of the chapter is given at the end. This is the first chapter of the 400 on yogic deeds, showing the means to abandon the belief in permanence.
Oh yeah, that Midaba se Tata Wakata Chasha Midabata. Tante Tata Shi Nangi, Taban Yambo, and a Midaba Koyagi, and the Masheta Savache. Taniwa Sachatabja Tungawa, se what Dini or Tungalan de Watzimba, Sergi, Tungalan de Watzimba, Tante Tata Shigana, the Tungalan de Watzimba, Sergita, or Digi, Niwade. So then
the first chapter then has explained the first of the four seals of phenomena, that is that all created things are impermanent. All created things are impermanent, so it's covered that. And then the second of the four seals, that all contaminated phenomena are of the nature of suffering. This is explained in the second chapter here.
Oh yeah, that's you was a judge, do not go Ani Dungalan Devata Chijilo, Dungala Devatan Big, Ani or Chijilo Boy Tap Dambata, Louis Shaba, Santaba E. Chani, Louis Shaba, Chudin Sosa Shaba, Tang, Rabshi, Go Dampache. That Chudin Shaba Della Sumche, or Rabbi Dunga Gomzu, Tang Sumche. Rabbi Dunga Gomzu Tella Sumi Benane, Ani or Dunga Dembi Lu Dembi Su. Dunga Dembi Lu Dembi Su, that I knew Benana, Lu Dunga to Toyang, Mayamba Songo, the Lula Hajan Chawa Pawai, Ni Ben Tambu Lu Dunga to Toyang, Temayamba Songo, what that did.
So then,
the
beginning of the commentary here lays out the structural outline of this chapter. The subject of the chapter as a whole is an explanation of the method for getting rid of the erroneous view, which grasps or misapprehends things as being pleasurable, and the way in which one does that is by meditating upon the suffering nature of the body, which is by its very nature contaminated. But this has a whole sequence of outline topics. There's no need to go in detail over the different outline topics at present, because they'll be introduced as we get to the specific topics sequentially. And then also the entire outline of the text is given at the back of the translation here as well. So if one wants to look at this basic basic structural outline. It's in at the conclusion of the translation or in the back of it. But here the basic topic is divided into two parts. Explanation of the body of the chapter. That first topic there is explanation of the specific words of the text. And that first topic there is showing how the way in which one meditates upon the suffering nature of the coarse physical body. That in turn has the first topic there is how one demonstration that the body has the nature of suffering or possesses suffering, and that in turn the first part of that is seeing, even if you see that the body has suffering as its nature, that it's even that being the case, it's necessary to take care of the body, to maintain it so that it doesn't disintegrate or deteriorate.
Oh yeah. 다 류동아도 통양 대민야바 수요 거와테 세데 나데 류는다다 통매자 대단하야 대순차 침대 유리 처원에 대라선음 전부치 세다 디임바리 와 기기 가르송 거래서나 사바다 제위 류데 아니 난근여바 안내리 시제자 시당 치녀바 안에 그 이바다 봉화라 소게 안에 동 소지 라스 numbe 안에 동아지 중군도 추외자 추외 안에 동아지 랑신 류대 동아지 랑신 무슨도 집에 파반 남지장세 무슨도 집에 파반 남지자 다다 통 매기 대단해야 류대 명예바 소와 차고 그래.
So the first verse here says that even though they see the body as being like an enemy, it's nevertheless the case that one needs to guard it, to take care of it. Those who possess the vows or rules of ethical conduct, who regulate themselves with ethical conduct, and maintain their lives for a long time in that way, they give rise to a great deal of merit. So that's the verse, first verse in the second chapter. And so here it says, the body which is contaminated is subject to all kinds of internal injuries including the 84 kinds of illness. And then there are also external sources of injury like sticks or shards of pottery or so forth, that when you step on them, they hurt your foot, lots of other things like that. And so the body, because it's subject to the internal and external injuries, is a source of suffering. And here then the Aryas, those who have understood reality, are able to see directly through perception that the suffering nature of this body. So in seeing it in that way, they know that the body is like an enemy as being a source of harm. But even though that's the case, they guard their bodies so that they won't deteriorate.
Oh yeah. 유디면 야바 송고레세 안에 단다디 가서 침대 요리 초외지 대라선은 편부치 세가라 추준다 대바 유rum부 초와라 때네 안에 대라 때네 소남다 이식의 소자샤부 초바 아니 어때샤바젠 아니 딜리 텐데지 토비 아니 류테기 아니 산제주 고마 토발체베 토비 가상관 주만하시 전에 최수국구 주제기 아니 주 산나다 이시 소자전부 소바체바 저 산나 전부 체바 인상 어다 류데 가서 라라 동아제바 끝내바 체바 다다 이나야 아니 유른데 아니 송고 그래.
So the reason they guard their bodies, the Aryas, noble beings that have realized the nature of the suffering nature of the body, and see it, they see it as an enemy, a source of injury, but they guard it nevertheless because they understand that those who live their lives for a long time in possession of ethical conduct, possession of the Shila sila, or these are especially the rules, vows that one takes to maintain ethical conduct, then from that, living that kind of life for a long time, they're able to perfect and accumulate a vast store of merit and gnosis, and in that way they're able to generate people that govern themselves with the rules of ethical conduct. They generate a great deal of merit.
동아 탐제지 중공세대 안에 가 류대 간대지 속으로서는 다 된다디 차와도시 그 동아 그러와 사실 일이 풍부되라 아니 동아 코와 제 풍부 세바나지 연예지 왕거춤이 풍부디 라 풍부디 아니 동아제라시도 통화대 개체셔진 바래 그러와 동아 속에 나네 동아지 동아 유 동아 아니 차와도시 그 동아 숨이 예배 나네 다 차와도시 그 동아야 때 동아제라시도 통해 되라 아니 내가 좋아야 돼.
So here then, when we speak of suffering, there are different forms of suffering, three principal kinds. There's gross suffering, pain and sickness and so forth, which are just ordinary forms of suffering. Then there's the suffering of transformation, in which that which is falsely perceived as being pleasurable actually transforms into suffering as such, to gross forms of suffering. But then the third form of suffering is the pervasive suffering of being created by contaminated karma and mental affliction. So our aggregates, samsaric beings' aggregates, are themselves all pervaded have this pervasive nature of being created by contaminated karma and mental affliction. And in that way, regardless of where one is born within samsara, no matter, even if one is free temporarily from gross forms of suffering, that one's aggregates, by their very nature, because of their being created by contaminated karma and mental affliction, they're of the nature of suffering. And that subtlest form of suffering, the pervasive nature of being created by karma and mental affliction, is the most important thing that we need to realize in order to engender within ourselves the desire to achieve liberation from samsara.
변전로서 취견생기 동아지 동아라 내준다 탄도 제와데 안에 텐로를 요와레 태안 동아라 안에 탄도 텐로라야 치 동아지 동아라 내준 제와다 탄도 제와 텐로를 요와체 사유 동아라 창유 동아 그 nen디 잡아 안에 텔라 탄도 그 안에 탑시 대 전조라 요와체 나 되니 사제 그 소원 대와세 나랑도 사제 그 차원 대와지 규 동아 어데라 사제 소원 대와라 이주 치러 와라야 치 사제 그 소원 대와라 이주 치대 안 대범이 치도 아니 삼대한 곰데 아니 소원 동아다 차와 아지 다 치러 와라요 이 말에 삼대 주문 히토에 대나 두지 동아지 사제 예련 풍보라세 나랑도 연예지 두체비 사제 예련이 풍보되라세 동아 줍단 줍아이 삼신권나 치료 주를 세가나 사제 예련이 풍보되 아니 동아 줍당 세가나 엄마 줍이 동아 또 제가 동아 줍당 줍아이 세가나 삼신권 아니 겁나 아니 치료 주를 세가나 안에 중계하게 봐요 연구를 했을 때 빼마 캄발라 다자 지송을 할 때 뭐가 제로와 사실권나 치료 주를 세
So then, with respect to these three kinds of suffering, Panchen Losang Chugi Gensen has said that the three types of suffering, the gross suffering, that is the suffering of being hot or cold, hungry, thirsty, those sorts of things, these are developing a kind of revulsion or renunciation of that gross forms of suffering suffering is nothing special, because even animals are disgusted, repelled by that kind of suffering. Animals they do with what they can to avoid getting hot or cold. When they're hungry, they search for food. When they're thirsty, they try to get something to drink. So having renunciation or revulsion towards that kind of suffering is nothing special. It's common to pretty much all ordinary beings. And then with respect to the second form of suffering, the suffering of the transformation, what this is referring to is the transformation of contaminated happiness. When samsaric beings experience happiness, it's contaminated by mental affliction, and because of that contamination, the happiness, the sensations of pleasure that samsaric beings experience, because it's pervaded with the contamination, it by its very nature transforms into suffering. It transforms into coarse forms of suffering, and that kind of suffering, the second form, is something that even non-Buddhists develop a kind of renunciation or revulsion towards. They're able to recognize that ordinary contaminated happiness is disgusting, and as a result of their disgust with those coarse forms of contaminated pleasure, they strive to develop meditative concentration that frees them temporarily from even contaminated pleasurable sensations. And so that's in a way not so special either, because even non-Buddhist meditators can do that. But the third form of suffering, the pervasive suffering of being created by contaminated karma and mental affliction, is the subtlest form, and that is unique to the Buddhist tradition. It's only through understanding the subtler dimensions of suffering, and particularly the way in which karma and mental affliction operate so as to produce the contaminated aggregates, and then getting a general recognition of the contaminated nature of the aggregates in their entirety, that one can develop the kind of renunciation that develops that can lead one into actual liberation from samsara. So he continues by saying that it's a real accomplishment if you can understand how your contaminated aggregates, your body and mind, in a state of contamination, regardless of how conventionally pleasurable you might be experiencing your life, if you can understand that these contaminated aggregates are themselves produced from a source which is of the nature of suffering, and that they in turn produce suffering in the future, then you've achieved the kind of recognition of the subtle form of suffering, the pervasive suffering of being created by karma and mental affliction. Then that serves as an actual basis for the development of renunciation and the wish to achieve liberation.
Oh yeah. 인자 동안 주단 주바에 삼성관나 청주서 동안 주바 스나 아니 랭이 풍보 사장님이 풍보 아마기 아니 치마 주바 셔봐 주변 주바 셔봐다 풍보 침 사장님이 풍 주비 아니 동아지당 풍보 사장님이 풍보 때 주바라 때네 아는 가위 동아 나위 동아 치위 동아 아제위 동아다 써봐 풍보 들을 때네 영화 on va trouver 동아 풍부 될라 때네 동아지 동아다 유유 동아다 유유 동아야 아니 풍부 될라 때네 좀아 on va trouver 동아 아니 풍부 코랑이야 아니 양이지 왕그 아니 중위 동아지라 신예바 아니 차와도지 동아랑 거 쟤네다 So
the aggregates are entirely pervaded with suffering, in that, like, for example, if we take the case of our current aggregates, which are in a state of contamination and samsaric in that way, then they came about as a result of karma and mental affliction, contaminated karma and mental affliction in the past. So they arose from something which is, by its very nature, suffering. The karma and mental affliction themselves are the causes of suffering, are pervaded with that suffering character. So out of that suffering cause, the suffering result of the present aggregates arose. These present aggregates that were produced from suffering cause, in turn give rise in the future, because of the current mental afflictions and negative karma, the contaminated karma that we're engaged in, which will in turn produce subsequent forms of the aggregates in the future, where they'll in turn be in a state of suffering. So the current aggregates came from a suffering source. They produce a suffering source, produce a suffering result in the future. And then because the aggregates are a basis for the arising of, at the present, of aging, sickness, and death, gross forms of suffering, the basic suffering of aging, sickness, and death, pain, misery, other kinds of unpleasant sensations, then the aggregates are entirely pervaded with this suffering nature, both in terms of cause, in terms of the effect that they give rise to in the future, as well as their basic character or nature, even in the present.
ane sacha nyelan bi phongbo di kur chizam ko 대신 도 농아지 라신래 ane dewi koga kayi ja meba yinzang sacha nyele ji phongbo de ta zadar thoya do.
So thus if we examine if we think about the way our aggregates, the body-mind complex that consists of our physical aggregate and sensation and so forth, these are entirely pervaded with suffering, both in terms of cause, the effects that they give rise to, their basic character in the present, past, and future, that they're pervaded with that suffering nature. Then we can think about them as like, it's as if we're carrying this huge burden constantly. And when you're carrying a huge load on your back, there's no moment while you're carrying that load that it's not a source of misery. There's not even a single instant while you have that huge load on your back that you're not in a state of suffering. And so if we think of it in that as the aggregates that we're in a sense carrying along in samsara, as being like a huge burden of misery, then we should be able to see them as an enemy and not view them as a source of pleasure and have the kind of attachment to them.
Oh yeah. That day, Lu Rada Buyana, Jawa Chawa, Maina, Nabi Toba Jaba, Yila, start the Tanchik Techa. Number Chiduni, Midabe Tamji, Sem Joshing, Lu de Anekara Rangi, Termayimba Chawa Mayimba, Termayimba, La Trembati, Jisha, Yamdo, Yawa Pambi Chidu, Luni Dradara, Sheba Chao, So
this is explained likewise in the commentary where it says that if you might think, well, if the body is like an enemy, then why is it something that one ought to protect? And the verse there cuts off that kind of, eliminates that sort of qualm by pointing out that one needs to protect the body as a means to preserving one's ethical conduct and to progress in that way. And then from one point of view, in one aspect, by means of the understanding the account of impermanence, one should So then, by understanding this account of impermanence, one should give rise to a sense of disgust with the body, but one shouldn't think about the body as if it's completely valueless, that it's something that one should simply cast aside as being meaningless. One shouldn't have that kind of attitude of disparaging one's own body in that sense, because it's something that one needs to preserve for the maintenance of one's ethical conduct and so forth. But nevertheless, one needs to see one's body as like an enemy in the sense that it's a source of misery.
Oh yeah, that is better. Something you put
An example that's given to illustrate this is there was a son of a merchant who was tied together with a thief, and because they were like handcuffed together, the merchant, even though the thief was his enemy, he took care of him nonetheless. So then the next verse explains how it's that one ought to get rid of excessive attachment to the body. And here someone might think, well, if the body is something that's to be taken care of, then why isn't it, I have to be especially attached to it, extremely attached to it, and take care of it with the food and clothing and so forth. Isn't that the case? And the verse here explains that, this is the second verse. I'm lost, sorry. This is verse 27. Yeah, okay. When human suffering is produced by the body and pleasure by other factors, why are you devoted to this hull? Or you could translate that as a shell, a container of suffering. And then it says here in the commentary, also, tu m'étais.
Oh yeah, Ane karerese menam dunga lu nye la jeshin dewa shen la nye yese. Menam zhego la sowe ane dunga kang chungwa teni ane lu la jeshin, lu nye la jeshin. Saikum ji tsimba so lu la dewa chungsa chungwa te ane chi jen shen kona la ra lene. Dunga kunji ne de kuwi lu ji khoban de la che ji de kuwi ji de kuwi bebe gawa drum ne wa tangsi. Bebe gawa drum ne wa tang. Saikwe la tembe nye wa ma chungwa te zam du jeba chao.
So then the response to that is that it's not the case that one ought to have this excessive attachment to one's body and to pamper it with special food and clothing and so forth. Here, the suffering which arises for people out of hunger, thirst, and so forth, that actually arises from the body itself. And when we satisfy ourselves with a little bit of food or drink or something, when we have a little bit of pleasure arising within our bodies, that occurs really solely due to independence upon external conditions. And since it's due to these external conditions, the body itself is, which is like kind of like a shell or husk within which we exist. It functions as a vessel for all of the various kinds of suffering that we undergo. And that being the case, why should you have a lot of effort to respect it? I'm sorry, I got lost here. So therefore, you should govern your body merely so as take care of it so as to be able to accomplish some virtue, and you should take care of it with food and clothing and so forth, just to the extent that it won't be harmed, so that the body can be used as a vehicle for the accomplishment of virtue.
그 배변가와 돈에 받아 사고를 때문에 야와면 좀 태점을 잡아 차오. 배나 샤사모 수제비 차제된 바시 미시기 신달라 견바당 대내는 뭐 말은비 안 눈도 샤사 미두바 시충아 라준네베 잡아당 샤사 이수 주와 대리장 제배 시준에 배나나가네 사실이 비매대사나 탐자 사바 주로 시에면서 대장 대사 제와 샤와 따라서 오다 미다바다 농아와 곰네 릴라 차바방디 아니 다 차와두셔 그 동아지 리드 미중와라세요 녀모 샤마도 집에 리드 미중와라 매바 차네 동아 타자 매바 주로.
Then there's an example that's given here. There was a beautiful a demoness, actually a flesh-eating demoness, who presented herself in the guise of a beautiful woman, and a man came along in a cart and picked her up in his chariot or cart, like a carriage, and carried her along. And shortly after that, a flesh-eating demoness who was extremely ugly appeared in front of them, and so the man took out his sword and chopped that ugly demoness in half, so that there were two demonesses now in front of him instead. And then he took his sword and he chopped the two that were in front of him in two, so that there were four demonesses in front of him. And then out of the sky, a god said, if you kill this woman that's next to you, then you'll be able to kill all of the demonesses in that way. And when he did that, and he was able to do that by killing the demoness who was in the guise of the beautiful woman next to him, and eliminating all of the four demonesses that were appearing in front of him in the sky. And if we behave like that, if we do as that example illustrates, then by meditating carefully upon impermanence and suffering, we'll be able to get rid of the attachment to our bodies. And if we make effort so that in the future, this kind of contaminated body doesn't occur again, that is, here the body that we're referring to is a body which is produced by karma and contaminated karma and mental affliction. So the body is entirely pervaded with this pervasive nature of suffering, of being a creation of karma and mental affliction. And if we make effort towards ceasing the arising of this kind of body in the future, we'll be able to eliminate all of the forms of suffering that we experience.
Oh yeah. 단위와 동화 검수 개와 시아바텔라 뒤에 전에 담보 아니 가서래 류라 소와 동아 시에쳐와 삼바들라 이 어당 대화 되지 동아 매제자 대화 되지 동아 매제다 동아지 제수 잡이 수삼바 다디 말에 아 담봉어에 이 예배나라 담봉어에 되라 간제 대화 동아달 시에시 밀라 미주나 대다 동아 쳐보디 충원양도 쓰면 제담 가데 동아디 동아 류코나라 중앙 동아세 류소 류지 초와 동아디 류코나라 중앙 가데 류지 초와 동아디 류코나라 중앙 대치수 예배 치주수 예배 아니 류소 동아디 또 충신 내가 체체와 임배 아니 동아라 미치수 세나
So the next topic that comes is an extensive explanation on the way in which we should meditate upon the suffering nature of the body. This has 7 subdivisions. The first is that this body that we have is we should think about it as being dominated primarily of producing suffering sensations. And this in turn has an actual explanation and then a way in which we should think about even if we desire pleasure and we don't desire suffering, that the body serves as a sort of source which brings about or has following after it suffering. And that's explained in the next verse, verse 28, where it says that when 28. When humans do not have as much pleasure as pain, should so much pain be considered negligible? And then so someone here might think that although pain occurs only because of the body, since it can be alleviated, it is weak and pleasure is greater. Therefore, one should not fear the pain.
간제 대화 동아 따라서 강기체 해진 동화 잠보라 두대 와 때는 잠보라 두대 유이도 와라 제비 대화 용신바 잠부 추른기 푸바나세 대화 용신베 내가라 잠부 추른기 푸바나 아니 대화 냠네 동아지 쪼르 좋아시 대신도 동아 치도단 데베 대화 시지 밀라 미주나스 동아 치도단 데베 대화 시지 밀라 마주나 대다 또 첨부대 충오냐도 셈바 체담디 셈바 미리베 아니 동아 알아 미리베 동아 와삼라 아니 쪼와쪼고 그래.
So the response to that is that take for an example, there's somebody who's sitting on a very comfortable, soft cushion. Here it says Devadatta, but that just stands for anybody. Somebody's sitting on a very nice, comfortable cushion, and they're enjoying themselves, experiencing a great deal of pleasure by enjoying beautiful things for a long period of time. So as they're sitting there, a wasp comes along and stings them, and at that moment then their pleasure disappears and they become miserable. They become miserable due to the suffering that they're experiencing. They feel a great deal of remorse, and just like that example, suffering is something which is extremely powerful, and on the other hand, pleasure is something which occurs very, very little within human life. And that being the case, isn't it that we tend to think that pleasure has more power, is more forceful, and that we don't think so much about the suffering, but we're not thinking correctly when we do that, that if we examine human life more carefully, that it's actually the case that suffering predominates and that pleasurable sensations are relatively weak And thus it's really incorrect, irrational to consider pleasure to have more force than suffering. And instead we should think about the suffering nature of human life and develop a kind of disgust or revulsion towards it.
Oh yeah, that is better. Nyam to December, Castle. Chungu Nyam to December, Miribe Dunga, Samna, Georgia, Benan Drajoji, and the Dunga Chibi, Tinsangi Chuma Chopa Chame. Dunga Tela, there were Chungu Yang Yaba Memba Nashin. Dunga Ji Dam to Chimbi, Silani Shawan to Chewy, Koabala, Dunga Ji Dam to Chimbi, Koabala. And then there was some Bayan, Koabala, Koyu Devalayan, there was some Bayan, Tetan Travare.
So an example that is given is there's a story of how a person named Bali stole Sugriva's wife. It took him a great deal of effort, but it nevertheless brought him nothing but suffering and no pleasure at all. To think of samsara as being pleasurable when one founders in a morass of suffering is just like that. Samsaric beings, they imagine that they have happy lives. They think of the pleasure that they are experiencing. They don't think about the suffering that is the basic character of life. And so they're very similar to Bali, who got some temporary, ephemeral little pleasure from capturing this other man's wife, but actually suffered a great deal in the final analysis.
Oh, that is there was the Dunga Medjang, Dunga Jis Chang Su Sambatella. There was the Dunga Medj, the Dunga Jis Su Sambatella. Jiden de Lang Shoshi, the Ju Tajan Yagati. Tena Ju Jidela, Dunga Jis Ibatra. There was Dunga Jin number tang, there was Dunga Jin number tang. And the castle, there was Chua Niji Chili. Jideman, there were Dubala, and then one about Choshi. See, Jiden de Lang on Choshi. There were Dubala on about Choshi. Dungala, and J. Meji, J. Meji. Dungaji Ranshinji, Li Dora Chua Tajang. Dungaji Ranshinji, Li Dora Chua Tajang, never covered. Ludi, Dungaji Ranshinji, Ludi. 아니 류대니 신자라 아니 류대어를 주고 타장이야 까디 세가 대주 타장이야 까디 데베리베 데베 데와 총하기 레베 아니 동아지 주석이 와레시 데와라 데와 총하기 레베 아니 데위 가서래 동아지 주석이 와레시
So then the next topic is that we desire pleasure or happiness, and even though we don't desire happiness, even though that's the case, in fact, suffering is what comes out of it, follows after our quest for our pleasure and happiness. So thinking about that is that ordinary people are bent on pleasure. Those who have pleasure in fact, are hard to find. Thus, it is as if transitory beings are pursued by suffering. Since pleasure is weaker and outweighed by suffering, ordinary people are bent on attaining pleasure and run from suffering. Yet it is hard to find those whose suffering body is comfortable, for in the hope of pleasure, they create the causes of suffering. So here this is saying that even though if we carefully think about how we exist in the world, most of the time we're in quest, we seek out and strive to achieve pleasure, but in fact, and generally in the world, most beings actually create the causes of their own suffering and experience that suffering by means of their bodies instead of achieving the happiness they desire.
뭐야? 아니 가서 걔나 기운 질때라 누가 제수 이바다 세대나 대나 소소 기우 깨지깨지기 지지미다 받디라 누가라 철수 생장 아니 누가니 저와 저 지나야 누가니 기우 처마다 제수 이베 랑 교육 제수 장거 처만에 봐 나시 동안에 교육을 처만 제수 이보단 차외 동아지 제수 장외 아니 동아 빵가와래
That being the case, then ordinary beings who are destroyed moment by moment because of their impermanence. They're impermanent, and thus the ordinary beings disintegrate from moment to moment, but they cling to themselves and other things which disintegrate moment to moment as if they're the source of suffering. So they're seeking those out. Nevertheless, they suffer by their quest for those, and it's just like a shadow following after a person. Just like that, suffering follows after ordinary worldly people, and is very difficult to get rid of.
Oh yeah, 맨날 랑제 녀외 지바, 아니 준비 체도 치네, 아니 라니 타르사 바단 자와래.
So it's like it's like someone. The example that's given here is like someone who's frightened by an enraged elephant and is being chased by them. They jump into a well in order to escape the mad elephant. But once they've done that, it's very difficult for them to free themselves from that kind of situation.
Oh yeah, that's
We'll stop there for now.
Jesus. Yeah.